She was not a woman anyone noticed when she walked down the street. Her shoes were worn, her hair tied back in a simple knot. Her eyes, dark and weary, told more stories than her lips ever dared. Her name was Evelyn Moore, though in the mansion where she worked, no one used her name. To them, she was simply the maid. Evelyn had lost her husband to an accident 5 years earlier. Since then, life had become a long hallway of closed doors, bills piling on the kitchen counter, nights spent wondering how to stretch one loaf of bread for her and her little daughter, Grace. She had accepted work wherever it was offered, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, carrying laundry that wasn't hers. And now she worked inside a palace of glass and marble. The Harrington estate stood like a fortress at the edge of the city. High gates, imported chandeliers, gardens trimmed so perfectly you might think every blade of grass had signed a contract to stay in place. Evelyn entered through the back door each morning, carrying a silence with her. She wore a plain uniform, ironed so stiff it made her shoulders ache. Inside, she dusted tables worth more than her entire life savings. She polished banisters that gleamed with imported wood. She set out crystal glasses that would never touch her own lips. Most of the staff ignored her. Some laughed when she passed. "Widow Moore, one of the nation." "Oh, but I don't mean." One of the younger maids whispered, still clinging to work as if it will buy her a new husband. They smirked when she bowed her head and said nothing. But Evelyn had long ago learned the value of silence. Words, she knew, didn't pay for medicine. Words didn't buy her daughter's school books, so she worked, quietly, faithfully, day after day. Still, sometimes as she stood by the tall windows and watched her reflection fade into the glass, she wondered, how long can a person be invisible before they disappear completely? What Evelyn did not know, what no one in that mansion could possibly imagine, was that her quiet, unseen life was about to collide with a moment so dangerous, so extraordinary, that it would change everything, forever. Children are supposed to be simple. They laugh when they are tickled. They cry when they fall. They forgive with a hug. But Daniel Harrington was no ordinary child. At 12 years old, Daniel lived inside a golden cage. His room was larger than Evelyn's entire apartment. Walls lined with books he never read. Shelves crowded with toys he had already outgrown. Screens glowing with games that kept him numb. He was the only son of Charles Harrington, a man who built empires with his hands and guarded them with his pride. The boy inherited not just his father's name, but also his father's distance. To Daniel, staff were not people. They were fixtures. They arrived like furniture and disappeared the same way. If his shoes were polished, he did not notice. If his meals arrived steaming, he took it for granted. And when Evelyn crossed the hall with a basket of linen, he barely lifted his eyes. One afternoon, Daniel sat at the long dining table, swinging his feet beneath the chair. Evelyn set a glass of milk in front of him. He didn't say thank you. He never did. Instead, he squinted at her, then whispered to his cousin who sat nearby, "Do you think she drinks milk? Or can poor people only afford water?" The cousin giggled. Evelyn said nothing. She placed the rest of the glasses carefully, her hands steady though her heart burned. Later that day, as Daniel burst out of the front door to meet his chauffeur, he passed Evelyn again. His sneakers were new, blinding white. Hers were gray, stitched 3 times to hold together. He noticed the difference, and rather than feel gratitude, he smirked. In his young mind, life was divided between those who had and those who served. He had yet to learn that fate does not respect such lines. That very evening on the street just beyond the mansion gates, Daniel would step into a moment so sharp, so fast that the world itself seemed to stop. And Evelyn, the woman no one saw, would be the only one standing between the boy and a tragedy that could not be undone. The evening air carried a thin chill, the kind that made the city lights shimmer as if the world had been polished clean. Evelyn had just finished her shift. She clutched her worn coat around her shoulders, stepping out of the mansion's back gate. The Harrington chauffeur had already driven past, a sleek black car humming down the drive. Inside was Daniel, his face pressed against the tinted window, bored with the world outside. He tapped the glass with his finger as if life itself were a video game waiting for his command. When the car stopped at a busy intersection, Daniel, restless as always, demanded the door be open. "I want to get some candy," he told the driver. ignoring the man's protest. Before anyone could stop him, Daniel had already darted across the street. And that's when time began to bend. A delivery truck barreled forward, its horn blaring, its headlights slicing through the dusk. The boy froze, his white sneakers rooted to the asphalt, his eyes wide with a fear he had never known. From the sidewalk nearby, Evelyn saw it all. She had been walking home, her daughter's school books tucked under her arm. In that instant, she did not see a billionaire's son. She did not see the boy who mocked her worn shoes. She saw a child about to be lost. Her body moved before her mind could. She dropped everything and ran. The truck's brakes screamed. The crowd gasped. And Evelyn threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around the boy, shoving him clear of the steel beast as it thundered past. They tumbled onto the sidewalk, her palms torn, her breath ragged. Daniel clung to her without thinking, his small fingers digging into her sleeve. For a moment, the street was silent. The world, stunned, had paused to watch. Then the whispers began. Isn't that the Harrington boy? Who's the woman? She saved him, that Maid. Evelyn's chest heaved as she looked down at the boy in her arms. He stared back at her, not with arrogance this time, but with something else, something closer to awe. What neither of them knew as the chauffeur rushed forward and the truck driver shouted apologies was that this single act, born in a breathless second, would set into motion a story far larger than either life had ever imagined. Forever, their worlds had just collided. The Harrington mansion had always been a stage of elegance, but that night its gilded walls seemed colder than usual. Daniel was rushed inside unharmed except for a small scrape on his elbow. Evelyn followed at the insistence of the chauffeur, her hands still trembling, her coat torn from the fall. The grand foyer was filled with the heavy perfume of lilies. A marble staircase stretched upward where Charles Harrington appeared, his tall frame casting a shadow against the chandelier light. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Evelyn. Who is this? His voice was low, sharp. She saved Master Daniel, the chauffeur stammered. Charles turned his gaze to Evelyn. Saved him or endangered him? Evelyn lowered her eyes. Sir, he stepped into the street. I pulled him back. Daniel spoke then, his voice soft, almost unlike him. Father, it's true. She saved me. But the words seemed to fall flat against the walls. Charles studied Evelyn with the kind of suspicion reserved for strangers at the gate. In his world, no one acted without reason, especially not a widow struggling to make ends meet. What were you doing there? He pressed. Evelyn hesitated. I was walking home from work. Convenient, Charles muttered, as though fate could be planned like a business deal. The room filled with silence. Staff members gathered at the edges, whispering. Some looked at Evelyn with awe, others with envy, but most with doubt. And in that silence, Evelyn felt smaller than she ever had. She had risked her life, thrown herself in front of steel and speed, and yet, standing in this house of marble and mistrust, it seemed her sacrifice was nothing more than a question mark. Daniel's small voice broke the tension. Father, she really did save me. Charles glanced at his son, then back at Evelyn. His jaw tightened. Perhaps, he said at last, but motives matter. The words sliced through Evelyn more deeply than the scrape on her palms. She bowed her head, clutching the hem of her coat. What she could not know was that this seed of doubt, planted in a single sentence, would grow into storms of rumor, betrayal, and heartbreak. For in the Harrington estate, gratitude was fragile, but suspicion had roots. By morning, the story had already spread. Not the story of a maid saving a child, no. That version was too simple, too pure. In the Harrington mansion, truth was like glass. It could be bent, warped, or shattered into whatever shape people wished. In the laundry room, Evelyn heard the first snicker. She threw herself in front of the truck, one maid whispered. Yes, but only to make sure Mr. Harrington would notice her, another replied. Smart move, really. Risk your life, earn his fortune. Their laughter echoed off the tiled walls. Evelyn, folding sheets at the table, kept her head low. She knew their words weren't born of knowledge but of envy. Still, each whisper landed on her skin like a lash. In the kitchen, the chef leaned over a pot, his voice heavy with contempt. People like her always have a plan. Don't be fooled. Nobody risks their life for free. Evelyn wanted to shout, to defend herself, to tell them she hadn't thought of reward, hadn't thought of anything at all except saving a child. But the moment replayed in her mind, the screech of brakes, Daniel's wide eyes, her leap forward, and she realized she couldn't explain it. It had not been reason. It had been instinct. And instinct in this house was not a language anyone believed. That afternoon, as she walked through the halls, she felt eyes following her. Servants paused mid-task to murmur behind hands. One guard shook his head as if he pitied her. Even Daniel, sitting on the staircase, watched as though torn between loyalty to his father and the truth he had seen with his own eyes. When Evelyn reached the servants' quarters, a note had been slipped under her door. She unfolded it with trembling hands. "Heroes don't hide in rags," it read. "We know what you're after." Her chest tightened. She pressed the paper against her lap and whispered into the quiet room, "I wanted nothing." But in the Harrington estate, whispers were louder than truths. And soon those whispers would climb beyond the servants' quarters, straight into the ears of the man whose suspicion already bloomed like a thorn. The call came unexpectedly. "Mr. Harrington wants to see you, now." Evelyn set down the silver she was polishing and wiped her trembling hands against her apron. The words had been delivered with no explanation, but she already knew. Whispers had been circling all week like crows. Now the master of the house was ready to judge. She followed the butler through the mansion's endless corridors, her heart pounding with every step. They stopped at the study, a room lined with books that looked as though they had never been read. A fire burned in the hearth, but its warmth did not reach the air. Charles Harrington sat behind his desk, a monument of mahogany between him and the rest of the world. Daniel was there too, standing near the window, his small hands pressed against the glass. "Sit," Charles ordered. Evelyn obeyed, her knees stiff. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I've heard quite a few stories about you this week." Evelyn clasped her hands together. "Sir, You only what?" His voice cut her off, sharp as broken glass. "Threw yourself in front of a truck? Risked your life for my son? Out of, what, loyalty or strategy?" Her lips parted, but words would not come. Charles rose, his shadow stretching across the rug. "Do you know what people are saying? That you staged it, that you timed it, that perhaps even the accident itself was not an accident at all?" Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide. "That's not true. I swear on my husband's grave, Swearing won't change perception," Charles snapped. "And perception is power. If my family's name is dragged into scandal because of a servant's ambition, it is my duty to protect it." Tears threatened Evelyn's eyes, but she held them back. "All I wanted was to keep him safe." For the first time, Daniel turned from the window. His voice was soft, uncertain. "Father, she did save me. I saw it. I was there." Charles looked at his son, then back at Evelyn. His face remained hard. Children see what they want to see. The words sank like stones into Evelyn's chest. She lowered her head, shame burning in her cheeks. Around her, the walls seemed to close in, the fire's crackle mocking the silence. When she was finally dismissed, she walked out of the study with shoulders hunched, her dignity stripped bare. In the hallway, servants waited, pretending to polish, dust, sweep, yet their eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. For in this house, Evelyn was no hero. She was a suspect. Children notice more than adults give them credit for. They may not always understand, but they watch, they listen. They feel the tremors adults try to hide. In the days after the confrontation, Daniel found himself watching Evelyn. At breakfast, he saw her hands tremble as she poured milk into his glass. Her knuckles were red, raw from scrubbing floors. When their eyes almost met, she lowered her head quickly, as though ashamed to even exist in the same room. At school pickup, when the chauffeur pulled the car to the gates, Daniel glimpsed her waiting on the sidewalk with her daughter, Grace, a girl no older than himself. Grace's shoes had holes at the toes, her backpack patched with careful stitches. Evelyn held her close, smiling down as though the child were a treasure, not a burden. Daniel looked at his own brand new sneakers, at the polished leather of the car seat beneath him, and for the first time a strange discomfort stirred in his chest. That evening he wandered into the kitchen and found Evelyn scrubbing pots. She worked in silence, her shoulders hunched. Something inside him wanted to speak, to thank her properly, to apologize for the words his father had thrown like daggers. But when he opened his mouth, the arrogance he had been taught rose up first. Why do you work so hard? Doesn't it get tiring being invisible? Evelyn froze. She turned slowly, her eyes wet but steady. Invisible? She whispered. Perhaps, but invisible hands keep this house standing. Daniel swallowed, unsure what to say. For once, no witty insult came. He simply stood there, watching her turn back to the sink, her tired shoulders bent under a weight he could not name. Later, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling. For the first time in his life, he wondered if wealth could blind a person, if maybe, just maybe, he had been blind all along. And though he didn't yet understand it, a seed had been planted, a seed of gratitude, a seed of change. The Harrington estate prided itself on order. Every hallway, every gate, every glittering chandelier, watched by cameras, guarded by eyes. Nothing, the staff often joked, could happen here without being caught on film. So when Evelyn's story of the accident was questioned, she clung to one fragile hope: the cameras at the intersection. Surely they would prove what had really happened. That morning, the chauffeur mentioned it quietly as he polished the car. There was a camera on that corner, he muttered. It must have captured everything. Maybe it will clear your name. Evelyn's heart lifted. At last, proof. By afternoon, Charles Harrington himself had dispatched a request for the footage. The staff buzzed with curiosity. Some scoffed that the widow's trick would finally be exposed. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had told the truth all along. But when the security company delivered its report, the room fell into stunned silence. The footage had been corrupted. Corrupted? Charles repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. A murmur rose among the servants. To Evelyn's ears, it sounded like a verdict. Yes, sir, the technician stammered. The files from that evening were erased. We don't know how. That's convenient, one maid hissed. Too convenient, another agreed. First she plays the hero, now the evidence vanishes. How clever. Evelyn's knees weakened. She had not touched the cameras. She had not erased a thing. Yet as she looked around the room, at the narrowed eyes, the doubtful stares, she knew her innocence was slipping through her fingers like water. Daniel, standing at the edge of the gathering, watched her. His face was pale, conflicted. He had seen her leap, had felt her arms shield him from the truck's force. But now, even he wondered, why would the only proof vanish? Evelyn turned away from their eyes, pressing a hand to her chest. She whispered into the quiet of her heart, Lord, please, do not let lies be louder than the truth. But in the Harrington mansion, lies had a way of finding a microphone. And somewhere in the shadows of the estate, unseen and silent, someone knew exactly why that footage was gone. Every mansion has secrets. They don't live in the marble walls or the gilded chandeliers. They live in the people who sweep the halls, carry the trays, close the doors when no one else is watching. In the Harrington estate, that secret wore the shape of Mr. Whitmore, the senior butler. He had been with the family for more than 20 years. His voice carried weight, his approval shaped reputations, and his presence was woven into the very fabric of the household. To new staff, he was the standard. To Charles Harrington, he was loyalty incarnate. But loyalty can curdle when pride is wounded. Whitmore had noticed Evelyn the moment she arrived. Her silence, her diligence, her refusal to gossip. She was different, an outsider who did not bend to the subtle hierarchies of the staff. And when she saved Daniel, thrust suddenly into a light brighter than anyone else in the house, something inside Whitmore cracked. It was supposed to be him the Harringtons relied upon. His name whispered with respect, not hers. So when he learned of the camera footage, Whitmore acted quietly, efficiently, a phone call to a friend at the security company, a favor cashed in, files erased, evidence gone. Now in the dim corridors at night, he lingered near the servants' quarters, listening to Evelyn's muffled sobs through the thin wall. His lips curled into something that was almost a smile. She doesn't belong here, he muttered to himself. And soon she'll be gone. But what Whitmore had not accounted for was Daniel. The boy had begun to notice the way the butler's eyes narrowed whenever Evelyn entered the room. He had begun to notice the quiet, bitter edge in Whitmore's voice when her name was spoken. Children see more than we think. And Daniel was seeing the first cracks in the man everyone else trusted. One day soon, those cracks would split open. And when they did, the Harrington estate would never be the same. The summons came on a Sunday evening. The mansion was hushed. the kind of quiet that settles before a storm. Evelyn was led once more to the study, her hands raw from a week of endless work, her heart already bracing for the blow she knew was coming. Charles Harrington did not sit this time. He stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the flames. Daniel was there too, perched on a leather chair, his face pale. Charles turned. "Mrs. Moore," he began, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. "I have decided your services are no longer required." The words struck like a hammer. Evelyn swayed slightly but caught herself. "Sir, please, I have done nothing wrong." Charles's jaw tightened. "And yet, the whispers grow louder. The evidence is gone. My family cannot endure scandal. Not for sentiment, not for charity. You must understand." Her voice broke. "Understand that I risked my life for your son, and now I am to be discarded like a broken glass." Silence pressed against the room. The fire popped, spitting sparks. Daniel shifted uneasily. "Father," he started, but the weight of his father's gaze silenced him. His lips trembled, but no more words came. Evelyn swallowed hard, straightening her shoulders. "Very well," she whispered. "If service is measured only by suspicion, then there is nothing more I can give." She turned and walked out, her steps slow but steady. Behind her, Daniel's eyes followed, torn wide with guilt, his small fist clenched on his knees. In the hallway, the staff pretended to work, but their eyes flicked to her as she passed. Some smirked, some looked away. One maid murmured, just loud enough, "Told you she wouldn't last." Evelyn pushed through the back door into the night. The air was cold, biting. She hugged her threadbare coat around herself, lifting her chin high even as tears burned her cheeks. For the first time in years, she did not know how she would face her daughter. And inside the mansion, Daniel pressed his forehead against the window pane, watching the figure of the woman who had saved his life fade into the dark. In his young heart, something cracked. He had remained silent when she needed him most, and silence, he now realized, could wound as deeply as betrayal. For a few days, the mansion seemed unchanged. The carpets still gleamed, the staff still moved in quiet patterns, and meals still arrived on shining silver trays. But to Daniel, everything was different. The halls felt emptier, the silence heavier. The laughter of the maids rang hollow without Evelyn's quiet presence nearby. At night, he replayed the accident in his mind. The screech of tires, Evelyn's arms pulling him close, the look in her eyes not of calculation but of sacrifice. He knew what he had seen, and yet his father's words, "Motives matter," echoed like a chain around his thoughts. One evening, unable to sleep, Daniel slipped from his bed and padded barefoot to the study. The house was dark, save for the moonlight spilling across the marble floor. He opened the drawer where his father kept reports, rifling through papers until he found the security company's note. Files corrupted, evidence lost. Daniel frowned. It didn't make sense. Cameras didn't just erase themselves. Someone had wanted that truth hidden. The next day, instead of joining his classmates after school, he asked the chauffeur to drop him near the intersection where it all happened. He stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the streetlight, the crosswalk, the corner where Evelyn had leapt. His heart pounded with memory. A shopkeeper nearby noticed the boy lingering. "You were there, weren't you?" the man said. "The day the maid saved you." Daniel's eyes widened. "You saw it?" The man nodded slowly. "Didn't see the jump itself, just the truck swerving and the two of you tumbling. But plenty of folks saw. Strange the cameras didn't catch it, though. My nephew works for the city, said the footage went missing that very night." Daniel's chest tightened. Missing, not corrupted. Stolen. He returned to the car with a new fire in his eyes. For the first time in his 12 years, he understood that truth could be stolen, buried, erased. And if no one else would fight to bring it back, then maybe, just maybe, he had to. That night, as he lay in bed, Daniel whispered into the darkness, "I won't let her be forgotten." The boy who had once smirked at a widow's patched shoes had begun his own quiet rebellion, and in doing so, he took the first step toward becoming someone new. Daniel had never felt so restless. Each day that passed without Evelyn in the mansion gnawed at him. The staff spoke of her as if she were a con artist, a ghost better forgotten. But Daniel knew better. He had felt her courage in his bones. He began sneaking time in the library, pretending to study while digging through his father's files. One evening, buried beneath receipts and contracts, he found a detail he hadn't noticed before. The erased footage had been handled not by the city, but by a private contractor recommended by none other than Mr. Whitmore. Daniel's stomach tightened. The butler, butler, trusted, revered, untouchable, was the very link in the chain. The next morning, he set out with a plan. Instead of climbing into the chauffeur's car after school, he lingered near the corner store where the accident happened. The shopkeeper recognized him immediately. "Back again?" the man said. Daniel nodded. "Did anyone else see anyone who was there that day?" The shopkeeper rubbed his chin. "Old Mrs. Carter, across the street. She's always watching from that window of hers. If anyone saw, it'd be her." Daniel's heart leapt. He hurried across and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was frail, her gray hair pinned neatly, her eyes sharp despite her years. "You're the Harrington boy," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Please. Did you see what happened that night?" She studied him, then slowly nodded. "I saw everything. That woman, your maid. She saved you. Without her, you'd be a memory child." Daniel's throat tightened. "Would you be willing to tell my father?" The old woman's smile was sad. "Your father? He wouldn't listen to the likes of me. But I kept something." She shuffled to a small table, pulling out an old phone. "I may be old, but I know how to press record. I caught part of it from my window." Daniel's hands shook as she played the clip. Grainy, shaky, but clear enough. Evelyn running, pushing him out of the truck's path. The sound of brakes, the gasp of onlookers. Proof undeniable and alive. Daniel's eyes burned with relief. For the first time since Evelyn had been cast out, hope surged in his chest. Clutching the phone, he whispered, "This will clear her name." But deep down, he also knew exposing this truth meant confronting Whitmore, and perhaps even his father. The boy who once hid behind silence was now standing on the edge of courage, and soon the whole mansion would tremble. Daniel entered quietly, his hands clutching the phone Mrs. Carter had given him. Charles Harrington sat at the desk, reviewing contracts. Whitmore stood nearby, his ever-watchful eyes narrowing as the boy stepped forward. "Father," Daniel said, his voice trembling, "we need to talk." Charles barely looked up. "Not now, Daniel. It has to be now." The firmness in the boy's tone startled even himself. Charles set down his pen and leaned back, studying his son with the wary gaze of a man unused to defiance. Daniel drew a breath and pressed play. The shaky clip filled the room with sound. The screech of tires, Evelyn's desperate run, her arms pulling Daniel to safety, the roar of the truck as it swerved. Even in grainy pixels, the truth blazed brighter than any rumor. Silence swallowed the room. Charles's face paled, his eyes fixed on the screen. Whitmore's lips tightened, his knuckles white around the edge of a chair. "She saved me," Daniel whispered, tears rising. "You doubted her, Father. You let them call her a liar. You let them throw her out, but she's the only reason I'm alive." Charles inhaled sharply, as if the weight of his son's words pressed against his chest. He turned to Whitmore. "You handled the footage request. You told me it was corrupted." Whitmore's jaw twitched. "Sir, Answer me." For the first time in 20 years, the butler faltered. His carefully built facade cracked. "It was a necessary precaution. She threatened the order of this house. She was nothing. A maid seeking attention." Daniel's small fist slammed against the desk. "She was everything, and you tried to erase her." The boy's cry hung in the air, louder than the fire, sharper than any rebuke his father had ever given. Charles rose slowly, his face grim. He looked from his son's trembling body to the phone still playing Evelyn's sacrifice. His empire, his reputation, his pride. Suddenly, they all felt like ash compared to the raw truth burning before him. For the first time, Charles Harrington realized he had been wrong. And in that realization, the mansion itself seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, the Harrington estate felt different. The staff whispered in corridors, not with scorn, but with unease. Something had shifted. Evelyn's name was on every tongue, not as a rumor now, but as a question. Had they all been wrong? Charles Harrington stood before the household, a man unaccustomed to explaining himself, let alone admitting fault. Yet there he was in the grand foyer, the chandeliers casting light on a face drawn with shame. Daniel stood beside him, clutching the phone that held Evelyn's truth. "I owe you all honesty," Charles began, his voice low but steady. "A woman risked her life to save my son. Instead of honoring her, I doubted her. I listened to whispers. I allowed suspicion to matter more than sacrifice." The staff shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged guilty glances. Whitmore, standing stiffly at the back, remained silent, his jaw clenched. Charles's gaze swept across them. "The evidence has surfaced. Miss Evelyn Moore is not a liar. She is not an opportunist. She is the reason my son is alive." Gasps rippled through the servants. The truth, undeniable at last, shattered weeks of cruel gossip. "And for my blindness," Charles continued, "I will make this right. Effective immediately, Mr. Whitmore is relieved of his duties." The old butler flinched, his face flushing. Without a word, he bowed stiffly and strode out, the echo of his footsteps fading into silence. Charles turned then to his son, whose eyes brimmed with tears. "It was my boy who showed me the truth, and now I must do what is harder than any business deal I've ever made." That afternoon, the Harrington car drove through the city, not for a meeting, not for a gala, but to a modest neighborhood where Evelyn and her daughter lived. When she opened the door, Evelyn looked smaller than ever, her hands rough, her eyes weary. She stiffened at the sight of them, expecting more judgment. But Charles, the man who rarely bowed his head to anyone, lowered it then. "I was wrong," he said simply, "and I have come to ask your forgiveness." For a moment, the widow could only stare, unable to trust her ears. Then behind him, she saw Daniel, his eyes wet, his lips trembling as he whispered, "Please come back." The bitterness in Evelyn's heart softened, just slightly, like ice under the first warmth of spring. And in that doorway, the first threads of healing began to weave. The days that followed were unlike any Evelyn had known. For the first time, the Harrington estate opened its gates to her not as a servant but as a guest. She walked the familiar halls with cautious steps, her daughter Grace holding her hand tightly. The chandeliers no longer seemed like cold symbols of wealth, but like stars reflecting a second chance. Charles Harrington greeted her in the grand sitting room. His tone was softer, his eyes less guarded. "Evelyn," he began, "I cannot undo what was said or how you were treated, but I can ensure that your courage is honored, not erased." He gestured to a folder on the table. Inside were documents, plans for a charitable foundation in his late wife's name. A foundation meant to provide education and shelter for widows and children in need. "I would like you to lead this," Charles said, "not as a servant, as a partner. You know better than anyone the weight of struggle, and I cannot think of a worthier steward." Evelyn's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she touched the papers, though she hardly believed they were real. "Sir, I am only a maid. I don't have the schooling, the polish." "You have something greater," Charles interrupted gently. "Integrity, courage, heart. Qualities money cannot buy and which this house has sorely needed." Grace's eyes widened, her small smile beaming up at her mother. "Mama, this could change everything." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. For years, she had bent her back and silenced her pride just to survive. And now, that silence had given way to a voice that could echo for others like her. Daniel, standing quietly beside his father, stepped forward. "Please say yes," he whispered. "The world needs to see you the way I do." In that moment, Evelyn saw not the spoiled boy who had once mocked her patched shoes, but a child transformed, tender, humbled, hers in a way she never expected. She closed the folder gently, pressing her hand over it as if to seal a promise. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll do it." And with those words, the widow who had been invisible stepped into a future brighter than she had ever dared imagine. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a quiet rebirth inside the Harrington estate. The widow who once walked through its halls with bowed head now entered with her daughter by her side, not as a servant, but as a leader, a voice for the forgotten. Evelyn's foundation took root, its mission clear, to give dignity where the world had taken it away. Charles Harrington, and Ben, who had spent a lifetime chasing power, found himself humbled in her presence. The empire he had built in steel and stone suddenly felt less impressive than the one Evelyn was building in hearts. He began to see that wealth was not measured in gold, but in gratitude. And Daniel changed most of all. The boy who once sneered at Pat's shoes now walked proudly beside Grace, carrying her books, sharing his toys, learning what kindness meant from the very woman he once overlooked. At night, he sometimes crept to Evelyn's study, just to sit near her as she worked, soaking in the comfort of her voice when she reminded him gently, "You are worth more than what you own." One evening after a long day, Evelyn stood at the mansion's tall windows, her reflection blurred against the glass. Grace tugged her sleeve, Daniel at her other side. Together, the three of them looked out at the garden, the stars just beginning to bloom in the sky. Evelyn whispered almost to herself, "I thought life had ended when I lost my husband. I thought I would always walk in shadows. But sometimes the very act of saving one life saves your own." Daniel leaned his head against her arm, and Grace wrapped her fingers around her mother's hand. They were not bound by blood. They were not bound by status. They were bound by something greater: sacrifice, forgiveness, love. And in that quiet moment, Evelyn realized she had not only saved a boy from an accident, she had saved a family from themselves. Forever,